Welcome back if you've been here before, and hello if this is your first time. Now, you've finally gotten all the parts to build the most epic PC ever that's going to have you gaming at 100 million frames per second at super ultra settings, but you're not quite sure on how to put it together. That's where I come in. I'm going to get you from feeling like this to feeling like that. Building a PC can be fun and challenging, but for the most part, it's fairly easy. Now, if you are curious about the parts that we will be working with, I'll have a link in the description to the first video where we went over all the parts and their prices. Starting off with the assembly, we're going to install the processor. Now, if you ever had a Lego set before, this should be fairly easy. Both our motherboard and our processor is rocking the AM3 Plus socket, so it's just a matter of lifting the latch, lining the pins on the CPU with the socket on our motherboard, and resting it right in. You don't necessarily have to force it in, but make sure it's nicely in there. Pulling the latch back down to lock in our CPU, and you're done. Not quite. Part of installing the CPU is installing the heatsink. Very critical. The heatsink is already applied with thermal paste, so all you gotta do is rest it on top of the processor, ensuring proper contact is made with them both. Now the hard part, securing the heatsink. No matter how tedious it might be, the key is to just take your time, lock one side at a time until the heatsink is fixed in place. And then, voila! Final step is to plug in the cable that came with the heatsink. On most motherboards, these slots are labeled, but I could be wrong, so do consult with your motherboard book guide, and not just nonchalantly throw it away. On this motherboard though, it's the slot that labels CPU fan. Before plugging it in, a very nifty trick is to tie the cable in a knot if it's too long. That would also help a lot with the cable management. After that's done, feel free to plug it in or whatever. Now it's time to install our RAM, probably the most easiest part of the installation, since it's just a matter of lining up the notch on our RAM with the break in the DIMM slots in our motherboard, pushing it down until the retention clips closes, locking it in place. Moving on with something more interesting, our graphics card. Just like most of our components, it's just a matter of finding its corresponding slot, which is the PCI Express 2.0 ports, and doing what she said. You can either install it while the motherboard is out the case or within. It's totally up to you. Pushing that aside for a bit, let's take a look at our PSU. Those 4 holes are what you will be lining up inside of our case to screw the PSU in. Between the power supply, motherboard, and case, you should have gotten 3 sets of screws. Some bronze standoffs to set the motherboard on, 4 PSU screws, and a couple of screws to screw in the motherboard. After organizing your screw layout, to install the power supply, all you do is put it through the slot at the bottom of the case and using the PSU screws to hold it in place. Taking a look inside the case, you should see some guide on how to install the motherboard standoffs depending on the size board you have. Our board is micro ATX, so every place that we see a U in the case, we're going to screw in a standoff so that our motherboard can rest on it so it doesn't get grounded, messing up the components. Before we can put in our motherboard, we gotta make room for our graphics card by removing the graphics card shield, pulling the retention clips back, and just
wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle.
Depending on the size of your graphics card, you may have to remove 2 or more slots. Just remember that when you do remove a shield, you cannot put it back in, so do remove accordingly. Finally, it's about that time we put in our motherboard and wrap up with this build. But before you do put in the motherboard though, it's highly recommended that you finalize any extra installations such as speakers, adapters, cards, anything of that nature that would help the workflow go smoother. And one more thing you're going to need when you're putting in the motherboard is the IO shield that came in with your motherboard. But don't worry though, if your motherboard didn't came in with any, you could always use the spare that came with the case. Although it might not match up that much, you could also take it out and just go in naked. When putting in the motherboard, make sure it's rested nicely on top of those bronze standoffs with the graphics card protruding outside of its slot along with the other I/O ports. To secure the motherboard, all you do is put a screw inside all of the holes and go around the motherboard screwing them in nice and tight. But if you never used a screwdriver before though, all you got to do is remember righty tighty and lefty-loosey, and you're practically an engineer already. JK, not really, but you're learning fast, kid. Now we've reached that part of the build that will definitely have us feeling like an engineer. So you're probably going to need all of these things. Wiring is not fun, but then again, it's not that hard. When putting together a PC, most of the cords do only go in one way, so it doesn't leave that much room for error. So feel free to grab the 24-pin connector on the power supply and plug it into the 24-pin slot on the motherboard. This is the biggest cable on the power supply, so that'll be hard to miss. What this cable does is provides power to the motherboard and all the components that's plugged in. Now it's time to plug in our ATX cord. It's either a 6-pin or 4-pin power connector that provides 12 volts to all the DC components on the motherboard. Depending on the motherboard you do have, you can either use the entire 6 pins or you can snap it off into 4. The slot that the cord goes to should be located somewhere above the processor, labeled ATX, either with 4 slots or 6 slots. And since we're talking about power, let's jump straight into audio. Turn the case around, you should see the HE audio cables, along with a couple of USB cables and the front panel cords. So take advantage of this moment by rerouting those cables underneath the motherboard, neatly tucked out of sight and out of mind, to the front portion of the case where we will begin with the installation. Both the USB and audio slots are located to the back of the motherboard, right below the graphics card. With the USB cable you have tons of slots to choose from, so just pick one. With the audio cable though, not so much, since you could only plug in either the HD audio or AC97 audio, and since I don't happen to know the difference between them and AC is in AC/DC, I'll have to go with the HE audio and plug that one in. Remember when I was giving you that lecture about not throwing away your motherboard book guide? This is where it will come in handy because your motherboard could be different than mine, so the installation of the front panel can be a bit different, but don't worry though, because you can't mess up unless you totally break something. The only thing that you could do wrong is probably misplace a wire, which caused the computer not to turn on, so you just go back and re-switch it back up. One of the reasons why we chose this case is because of its toolless design that makes putting in hard drives super easy. It's just a matter of sliding the latch and putting the hard drive in and sliding it back to secure the hard drive. To wire up your hard drive, you're going to need one of these cables. It's a SATA cable that probably came with your motherboard, and you're going to need this hard drive power connector that should be on the power supply. The SATA connector should be on the motherboard, left of the speaker towards the bottom. You just plug that part in and plug the other port into your hard drive. Along with the other connection that's coming from the power supply, you plug that one into the back of the hard drive too, and then you're done. Just like everything else in this computer, wiring the graphics card is fairly easy. It's just a matter of finding the correct wire. In this case, it is a 6-pin PCI cord, and just like every other cord, it does only goes in one way, so plug that in and the GPU should be able to get power once it's turned on. One of the last but very important things we got to do is install all of our Molex male to female fans. With all the fans in this case, we will need an adapter. The way this is going to work is by plugging the male end of the fan into the female end of the adapter and plugging the adapter into the power supply, then plugging the nearest fan's male plug into the connecting fan's female socket. Then you can plug all the other fans straight into the power supply. Do this right and every fan should be spinning when turned on. Finally, after the dust has settled and the wires have been laid to rest, you can finally plug this bad boy in and see if those CS101 classes paid off. But don't worry though if this computer doesn't turn on, because most likely if it doesn't turn on, you probably didn't turn on a switch or forgot to plug in something. So go ahead and go into the BIOS and check for any error messages or beep codes. If there aren't any and this computer did boot up successfully, that means the installation was a success and you deserve a pat on the back. And since we're here anyways, we should just go inside the BIOS and start setting the time and date for this computer and all the other defaults. And Waymisimo, we did it! But this cable management is horrible. Our case looks a mess. Time to fix that. The best way we know how, with a snap. And now since that's out of the way, let's do a final boot to make sure that our snapping didn't mess anything up. And good. And since this is a gaming PC, why don't we just get a sneak peek and test this bad boy out. So yeah, thanks for checking out my PC build tutorial. Obviously, this isn't gonna be the last video in this series. Still got a few more videos to go. Probably the next video is gonna be about the best configurations and all the benchmarks. So make sure to subscribe and check that out. Actually, I'm gonna need your guys' help just by leaving any benchmarks or games that you want to see this PC run in the comment section, and I'll just throw it at this PC and see how it does. Glad I could be a help to you guys, and any feedback is gladly appreciated. And yeah, thanks for checking out ETH. See you next time. Peace.